teacher. He said my sermon, and they changed it to my speech. I'm much more comfortable with that.
There you go.
A lot of, by the way, the school teacher thing, this is I figured if I'm going to teach in an environment I'm uncomfortable with, I should have some remnant of where I'm comfortable, which is the classroom. And this is actually a tie that was a gift from my class, so it makes me feel comfortable. Sure, it's a gift for life. You commented on the color of it. It's a book that it's your choice. Before we start, I want to say something about Len. I met Len in 1995. I just come to town. Janae and I were married in 1994, and that spring, our two older boys, I signed them up for Little League. And I never coached kids there, you know. I didn't know really how to break a game down to them. And I remember, I go out to the field. We're going to play this team called the Hawks. And, geez, they look good. And there was this big man with this huge claw, and he took the bat with one hand, and he hit infield practice with one hand. It was just, you know. And he was drilling. I mean, he was drilling at these kids. And they were scooping it up and throwing it around, and sitting in the dugout, looking at my kids going, oh my God. And first time we played, they whooped us. And because they were the best team in the league. Len was the best coach in the league. And I thought, man, he showed me something. You can push little kids. You can push them in the right way. And now the second time we played it, with that lesson and some others, I had pushed my kids in the right way, and they got them. They got them. It was their first loss. And I went home just so satisfied. And then I get a phone call. It's Len. You can, first of all, he congratulated me. And then he let me know something. He said that my kids, my two boys, had trash talked a little bit. And it wasn't right. I told him he was right. Thank you. And that told me what kind of man he is. Because he wanted my kids to do right. So, that's why I chose him. So, to my message, before I get too much of a Bill Smith here. Alright.
I'm full alone, Bill Smith right now.
Lord knows if I'm crying, you're crying. Alright. Vincent talked 2 weeks ago to all of you really about his intention for this year. It's about our personal journeys from bondage to freedom. And I'm just doing a variation off of that today. It's about our nation's journey from bondage to freedom. And in the second half of this, it really is more focused on Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. But in the first half, we have to establish the injustice. So as we look at our nation's journey, let's start at our nation's birth, the Declaration of Independence. You should be familiar with the words. I make my kids memorize this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson offered that to mankind as the beginning of a philosophical argument that said, rights are inside each of us, sown into our nature, and no government can legitimately take them away without cause. And if they do, that gives you a fourth right, a right to alter or abolish that government. By the time the Declaration was written, we had got to the point where we wanted to abolish. Now that's the philosophical argument, the broad argument. Below that was what they called a list of grievances, specific ways that King George had violated our rights. And in that list, he had this. He, King George, has violated the life and liberty of a distant people, captivating and carrying them into slavery in this hemisphere. Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, was blaming blaming King George for the establishment of slavery in the colonies, perhaps as a way to rid the new states of it. He was deeply conflicted. But that clause did not survive the debate in Continental Congress. In fact, John Rutledge from South Carolina said, "If you keep that in, I will fight with the king against the states." So they removed it. And the Declaration passed. Thank God it did. We won our independence. And we tried this form of government called the Articles of Federation, a loose alliance of states, and it didn't work. So we get together in Philadelphia and write a new framework, Constitution. And it begins with words that I'm sure you are also familiar with. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, later generations. We the people established the Constitution of the United States. Our Constitution says that the people, that this new government in the name of the people establishes justice and secures liberty to all later generations. But that Constitution also included these three clauses. 3/5 of all other persons. The migration or importation of such persons. No person held to service or labor. The person referred to was slaves. And in our Constitution, they were fractions and property to be owned. And it was protected. The Declaration, our philosophical foundation, proclaimed liberty and equality to mankind, but omitted any reference to slavery. The Constitution, our legal foundation, promised to all later generations justice and liberty, but 3 times established slavery. Now, please, in pointing this out, I am in no way trying to diminish our founders or their documents. They are amazing. They are great. But our founders were men, and they were flawed. And our founding documents were compromises, and they were imperfect. And I want to see if I can illustrate what that imperfection is. What our founders did is they went to one side, and they reached deep into the Enlightenment and Judeo-Christian principles, and they pulled out of it with great effort the highest of human principles, justice, and liberty, and equality, and they wrapped it all into our documents. But they also reached way down to the lowest of human practices, and they, with great effort, wrapped it in the same document. And that creates tremendous tension on those documents and our nation, because those things pull mightily in opposing directions. And that was our history early. And this tension became greatest when we expanded. What are we going to do with slavery? New territories. And we did what we knew how to do. We compromised. Missouri Compromise of 1820. Compromise of 1850. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. But every compromise seemed to lead to more conflict. So we went to war in 1861. And in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln defined the war as a test to see if a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, belong and endure. And the only way to pass that test, he said, was a new birth of freedom. So a government of the people, by the people, for the people, would not be it. That was the only way. For a moment, we passed. 13th Amendment emancipated 4 million people, 1865. 14th Amendment gave those people citizenship and protection for their rights, equal protection of the law. 15th Amendment provided a guarantee the right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 1868, 1870. A massive wall separating black from white had come crumbling down. And the next decade was amazing. don't know about it, but it was amazing. What we did is we put the military in the South as we reconstructed the southern states into a union. And they enforced, with guns, unfortunately, these amendments. And we watched the following happen. Over 200 African Americans were elected into local political office. Over 600 African Americans were elected into state offices. There were 14 U.S. House of Representatives who were black. 2 U.S. senators who were black. It would be another 130 years before we had 2 more. This was the height of black political representation in our nation's history. In the 1870s, in the South. Now, this should be celebrated. But for most, not even just in the South, this was an abomination. Let me explain. To Southern whites, this was a shotgun wedding. They were being forced to stand side by side and be told that they were equal to people they had owned. And that was being done while the army that had conquered them supervised. It was a shotgun wedding, and they would not be faithful. So even before that army left, they picked up their shotguns, and their robes, and their hoods, and their crosses to be burned. And when finally that army left, some in 1874, some in 1877, they picked up the ballot. They swore their oath to the United States and picked up the ballot and began to reform new majorities, political majorities, with which they could build a new wall. You see, the problem is that the war and the amendments that followed never addressed the hearts, the diseased hearts that were behind the walls. They just corrected the walls and left the hearts in place. The guns of the U.S. Army that supervised Reconstruction did not address the diseased hearts behind the walls. So we created a new wall. We call this wall in history Jim Crow. I want to break Jim Crow laws into, if you ask me later, I just don't want to take the time on who Jim Crow was and what that was. But I'm going to break Jim Crow into four different kinds of laws. The first 2 really have to do with forced labor. And I bet you haven't heard of it. First is called convict leasing. Here's how it worked. Step 1. You criminalize ordinary behavior. I'm not making these up. You pass laws that make it a crime for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad at any time of the day. You make it a crime to sell your brain at night. You make it a crime to speak loudly in the company of white women, to loiter, to spit. Make it a crime to not be employed. Vagrancy laws. So for standing, or not being able to find work, or loitering, or walking, you could be arrested. And then step 2, you make these crimes not misdemeanors, but felonies. Now as felons, you can now implement step 3. Southern states implemented something called convict leasing, where, for as long as your sentence was, you could be leased out to a mine where they're mining coal, a large-scale farm. You could be leased out to new industries that are being built in the South for as little as $9 a day as labor. And since there was no big investment on the part of the company, and these were felons, you could work as hard as you want. There was no investment in health care. There was no investment of, I paid $1,000 for a field hand. You just paid $9 a day. Work them to death. And they did. Death rates in some states for convicts who were leased out was 30 to 40%. And 90% of all convicts leased out were African Americans. Some as young as 14 and 15 years old. That's convict leasing. Peonage. Peonage comes from a Latin American practice called debt servitude. That your debt would put you into servitude. Here's how this works. By the way, debt was a way of life for Southern blacks. Most of them were sharecroppers, tenant farmers. They had to take loans just to get crops in the ground. You accuse somebody of not paying back their debt. You take it before a justice of peace, no jury, no lawyer. Victim. As the punishment, you give them a fine, court costs. Pay. So you contact a local white man who pays the fine and the court costs, and then, quote, takes charge of them. Once in charge, they could sell them to a local farmer or businessman. And part of that sale was a contract that was signed by both the peon, that's where that word comes from, the one who was sold, and the businessman and the farmer. The contract would allow for confinement for as long as the debt was unpaid, whipping as discipline, and even the right for him to be shared with others. What does this sound like? Now, I know it's all pretty heavy stuff. Hopefully it's a little lighter, even though it's tragic. They also passed voter discriminations, poll taxes, and residency requirements, and literacy tests. There's a lot of examples I could use. I just want to choose one. One was the literacy test of Louisiana. Louisiana had a 30-question test. You had to answer in 10 minutes. Okay? If you got one wrong, just one, you couldn't vote. See, the whole idea here is that you had to prove yourself literate before you could vote. You missed one. You couldn't vote. Here, I have 30 questions. I'm going to give just 5 examples. Just listen. Number 15. In the space below, write the word noise backwards and place a dot over what would be its second letter should it have been written forwards. Number 20. Number 20. Spell backwards, forwards. 21. Print the word vote upside down, but in correct order. 22. Place a cross over the 10th letter in this line, a line over the first space in the sentence, and a circle around the last the in the second line in this sentence. I'm not making this up. 23. Draw a figure that is square in shape, divide it in half by drawing a straight line from the northeast corner to its southwest corner. And then divide it once more by drawing a broken line from the middle of the western side to the middle of the eastern side. Needless to say, I failed the test. And so would all of you. Because if you could actually do these 30 questions without your brain oozing out of your ears, you were going to fail anyways. Here's how. They all had loopholes. Every one of them. For instance, take a simple one. Spelled backwards, forwards. If you spelled backwards, just backwards, you failed. Because you didn't spell forwards. And the instruction was to define backwards, forwards. Or spell backwards, forwards. If you spell backwards, forwards, you fail. Because then they will say, it said to spell backwards, forwards. You can't pass. That was what it was about. Every single person that administered these laws would give a passage to read and interpret or a test to do, and every single one of those poll workers was liked. And they were given the discretion who passed and who did not. These were to disenfranchise blacks. But the protests about these laws came from those who argued it also disenfranchised poll taxes and residence requires and literacy tests poor and undereducated whites. So they came up with an exemption called the grandfather clause. Just in case. Let's pass a grandfather clause. And grandfather clauses said if your father or grandfather was not registered to vote prior to 1867, you couldn't vote. You'd have to take these poll taxes and residence requirements and literacy tests. That's the exemption. You could avoid all that nonsense if you could prove your father or grandfather was registered to vote in 1867. No black could vote before 1868, the 14th Amendment. In 1870, the 15th Amendment. Why do you think they picked 1867? In 1896, Louisiana had over 190,000 African-American voters. They passed the literacy test and the grandfather clause, and in the election in 1900, they had less than 5,000. Under 90,000. Now, with voting discrimination in place, you could segregate. You could pass segregation because your majorities in the legislatures were absolutely by now. And boy, they segregated everything. I mean everything. In the South, they segregated schools, stores, restaurants, hotels, drinking facilities, restaurants, apartments, where you could work, what work you could do, courtrooms, juries, parks, cemeteries, churches, the Bible. In courtrooms, there was a black Bible swearing in, a white Bible swearing in. In Louisiana, did you not, they segregated prostitution districts. In Birmingham, Alabama, they listed a number of these areas in a wall that was about this long, and the last line said, and in any other indoor or outdoor facility. And I thought to myself when I read it, save the ink. Just say blacks and whites may not interact in any indoor or outdoor facility. When I first started teaching, I was teaching about world cultures, and I was teaching about the Indian caste system. And I was just learning about it myself, and I was amazed. The caste system had all these layers, and the bottom caste was something called untouchables. And untouchability was a strange thing to me and my kids, because if somebody in that lowest caste would just touch somebody in the higher caste, they soiled them and could be punished with up to death. But the real absurdity came in this one example. And I explained it to the kids. I would have a student there, and I would say, one of the laws said that if the sun was there, and I'm untouchable, and my shadow falls on you, and you're in a higher caste, I have soiled you. My shadow can soil you. And the kids go, that's crazy, Mr. Rutherford. That's insane. I said, yeah, I know. And then a couple of years later, I'm teaching this in U.S. history, and I find these laws, and I go, in much of our country, blacks could not get close enough to whites for their shadows to cross. You go, it's incredible. But I have more incredible for you. If you're going to establish segregation laws, how do you determine race sometimes? You see, one of the things that justified the segregation laws in law was Plessy versus Ferguson. It said, Plessy versus Ferguson established really the rule for segregation. What it said was that separate facilities are constitutional as long as they're equal. Separation isn't discrimination. Just make the number of facilities equal. Separate but equal. But here's the background story of that. Homer Plessy, the guy who was the basis for this rule, was 7/8 white, 1/8 black. He had one great black grandmother. But in Louisiana, if you were 1/8 black, you were 8/8 black by law. 1/8 equals 8/8. That's bad math. Now, it was a setup. They chose Homer Plessy purposely to go on the white card and challenge in law, in court, the Separate Car Act of 1890. He goes into the car, and the ticket taker does not recognize him as black. So he has to tell him, because he has to be arrested to challenge the law. He says, I have a black great-grandmother. Come with me. They arrest him, they take him into court, he goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and he loses. Because 1/8 equals 8/8, and that's equal protection of the law. But that wasn't separation enough. In 1910, we started redefining the fraction. States started saying 1/8 is not enough separation. They started passing laws that said 1/16, 1/32, and then eventually it became 1 drop. If you had any African heritage whatsoever, you were wholly black in the law. And this wasn't just in the South. This was Indiana, Nebraska, Utah, North Dakota. It was expanding. Not retracting, it was expanding. So then you go, wait a minute. What about married couples? How do we regulate children that can pass? How do we define this? In a series of court cases, they upheld these miscegenation laws laws, interracial cohabitation, any relationship that could produce offspring that were of mixed race, was refused in law, so they became illegal. They became felony. To marry somebody of an opposite race was a felony. And in a series of court cases, they established that it was permissible to introduce into evidence a biracial child as evidence of a crime. A baby could be evidence of a felony. And then you go, well, it can't get worse than that. How do you enforce this law? There was, how do you enforce a law that says one drop, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, in days before DNA tests? Well, you do it by testimony. In a series of court cases, they decided that it was okay for prosecutions to establish race in a court of law through testimonies about whether you talked to black people, socialized with black people, attended in church and worship with black people. If you did that, it was evidence that you had one drop. The insanity of it is that the evidence that you had violated segregation law was that you had violated segregation law. And you go, what do you do with that? Which is what I ask myself as I'm studying this. Again, I feel obligated to explain it. I am not condemning America. I am not condemning America. Too often when we say these things about our history, people call you unpatriotic, and they say you're condemning America. I'm not. I'm not. Our founders, our founding documents in our country are great. I love it to my core. That's why I wish you would read them all the time. But we're imperfect. Our country is not advanced by pretending it's perfect. We are imperfect. And the injustice of Jim Crow was a self-evident truth to anybody willing to look. And for people of color, it was an impenetrable barrier to accessing the self-evident truths of equality and liberty and justice. Just one more illustration. I recently saw Les Miserables. Saying that right? With my wife. About the only musical I've ever liked. And there's a scene in the alley where the revolutionaries, the rebels, the dispossessed, who are fighting a good fight, call for things to be thrown from the windows. Just throw anything. We're going to set up a barricade. People throw out chairs and tables, and, all these things. And they build a barricade out of it. It's kind of ugly, but it's useful because it keeps those on the other side out. Well, think of this. In Les Mis, it was those with little, the dispossessed, the powerless, that built the barricades to keep those with power away. Jim Crow is the powerful, those with power, finding whatever they can and just loading it on to keep those without, the dispossessed, the powerless, away. Convict research, peonage, boom, debt, boom, 1/16th, 1/8th, 1/32nd, one drop. Anything we can find. Segregation in schools, segregation in church, anything we can find. Swearing on this Bible, swearing on that Bible. Anything we can find, we load it on until the wall is enormous. It's a barricade of enormous magnitude. It is a mountain that separates us. So, for just a minute, just a few minutes, I want you to imagine. Imagine if you can. Take yourself back to that time. And if you are white, or if your skin is fair, imagine it is dark, and it can't wash away. And you can't get away from it. And you are behind that mountain. What do you do? That mountain keeps you from every promise of America. What would you feel? How could it ever be tore down. I want you to consider that. That's all my wife's saying.